Hey guys, welcome to UA Coffee Talk. Today we're going to be talking about a blog post from Nebo. Nebo, you created a blog post that was titled Why D7 ROAS Might Be the Worst KPI to Optimize Towards Since CPI.
Yeah.
So I thought we could just open by having you provide a little bit of context in terms of, why did you write this blog post? What's the kind of story behind, your motivation to write about this topic?
Sure. So basically, when I joined Network, my role changed quite a bit because it was a significantly smaller company.
Yeah.
So I was not just responsible for my campaigns. I was also responsible for the money.
Yeah.
The company's money and when it's going to pay back, right? I mean, that's what every single marketing person should be.
That's right.
But in reality, that's not really happening.
Yeah.
So over time, when you start looking to the data and trying to understand what's happening with the money you're spending, you see these patterns and you see that most people are using certain metrics or KPIs to optimize their campaigns, and they're not really the best KPIs to look at, or they cannot be looked at in an isolated way. So that's something I've been looking into for a while, thinking about it for a while. And then when VO started really taking off, and when basically most of our Facebook's spend moved to VO, I started noticing these patterns in payer retention and cost per payer that were somewhat limiting to us and prevented us to scale further. And I felt like I need to just write about this and share more about this and explain how different optimization models impact the health of a certain business.
And just for our audience out there, when we talk about what do you mean by optimizing towards a KPI? So you're talking about when you're trying to determine your UA budget or how much you're spending against a specific channel or something like that, then you use that KPI to allocate how much budget to spend, right?
Yeah, exactly. So initially it was just CPI. We would find sources with the lowest possible CPI and then spend more money there.
Right.
Then people were like, "Oh my God, this is all fraud. I'm fucked. I should do this more, in a better way." So people moved away from CPI to ROAS, and the campaigns that have higher D1 or D7 ROAS get more budget, and as a result, your overall ROAS should improve.
Right.
But that's not always the case,
right?
Because it's just your short-term ROAS improves, but that doesn't really mean that the money is paying back sooner.
And ROAS, we mean return on ad spend.
Exactly.
But you actually had a session. There was an event, UA Master Summit by Bidalgo, where we had 25 UA experts from San Francisco, and you asked the question, what KPI do you guys optimize against? I think, was it 24 out of 25 or 25 out of 25 were D7 ROAS, right?
Yeah. It's easy to work with D7 ROAS. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. The cohorts are mature enough, so you can make some conclusions based on after 7 days, based on the quality of that audience. But at the same time, if you just look at D7 ROAS, it's not good enough. So you have to kind of understand what the retention is, what optimization models you're using, whether it's Facebook, Google, is it instant or a rewarded video. So basically, I just try to explain how these different levers impact the performance, and that if people want to spend money at scale, they really need to look beyond just ROAS.
And just kind of even stepping back, why do you think people use D7 ROAS? And 7 days, because you want something that's quick. So 7 days kind of gives you a full week of data. But I guess that the issue I have is that, it feels like a lot of UA marketers just want to, they don't understand the why. They just want to know, what do I do? What's the D7 ROAS target? And they don't really question it very much.
Well, the short answer is we're lazy, right? Let's be real. I just want the most simple KPI that I can drive and execute and just go balls to the wall to it. Right? And that's a fundamental issue with our space, is that we can't think of just taking the most easiest KPI because it doesn't fit. And that's why I really like your article, because I remember when I was at Play Studios, when was it VO or AU? I can't remember. It was when Facebook recently launched a new kind of bid optimization model, and then we're like, oh man, D7 ROAS is great. Let's throw a ton of money at it. Then we look at like day 60.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, this is interesting because like what we saw was like on day 7 there was a rewarded video network where the ROAS was lower, but the curve of that was much more consistent over a longer period of time, whereas like Facebook would flatten out. And so if I look at day 60, if anything, that rewarded video network actually did better. Yeah. Right. So in that particular case, you're like.
Yeah, that's because of the cost, basically. With like these sophisticated optimization models, you pay significantly more for a user, and then your risk profile increases. Right. And that's what most people don't really understand.
Right. And that's why like the article that you wrote actually talked about like the cost, the driving up the cost of acquisition. Yeah. Like yes, from a actually getting a user that is paying money, I think Facebook does a really, really great job. Yeah. Because it's so expensive to get that user on that platform.
Does it risky,
actually make sense? And not to say like, you know, don't spend money on Facebook. It's just like you have to, what we realize is that, maybe you really should have a different KPI by channel. Right? Yeah. Obviously, if you're working with 100 different channels, it's very, very hard to do that. But let's say like, even if you dilute it to something, you know, an in between like ultra granular versus like the laziest thing is like even like for rewarded video, like this is going to be my D7 ROAS.
Or focus on top 10 channels by spend.
And break it out like that because you understand like different placement types, different channel types have different payback windows, and you have a different goal for each, right? When it's the issue arises, I don't think there's a fundamental issue with D7 ROAS. The issue is when you consolidate all your channels into a single metric instead of separating it out.
Yeah. Another reason, just to get back to your original question, why D7 ROAS is popular. It's easy to report on D7 ROAS, report upwards. That's another thing that I didn't really understand when I was part of a much bigger marketing team. Yeah. It's like executives don't really understand what cost per D7 payer means. I mean, they do, but it's just like, it's not a very like an easy to understand and to report on metric. Right. And as a result, like D7 ROAS is significantly easier. Everybody understands it. Yeah. You know, it's how much money returns by day 7. Right. You know, the higher it is, the better. Yeah. Or not really. So that's what the article is about. And I'm glad that, you know, it seems that people really enjoyed it, and I'll try to.
And in terms of like, so some of the key points from your article is that, you know, basically the monetization profile based upon channel, by geo, by platform all look different. So if you are going to use a D7 ROAS target, then you need to separate that stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I'm not sure is well understood is why, like just even going back even further, why and how the D7 ROAS metric is computed, right? And so I think some people don't understand. So just for our audience, basically the way D7 ROAS is actually calculated is you try to take your LTV and you're assuming some type of ARPU curve, right? So you're assuming that there's a monetization profile that grows over time. Yeah. And you're trying to think about if you're on target in terms of the growth, where should the ROAS be at day 7, right? Yeah. But the other thing that isn't taken into account is that for a lot of games that ARPU curve is going to look different. Yeah. And so like it's basically just a multiples model. Yeah. Yeah. But you know, those ARPU curves could all look very different, and
and you know, like users in Russia behave completely differently than users in the US. Right. Because of like multiple factors, and you cannot really use the same solution to estimate what the LTV is going to be or what the money is going to pay back. I mean, we have predictive LTV models and we use those. I understand that's a challenge for a lot of companies, but at least, you know, figure out what are your top 10 sources, right? You know, whether it's like Facebook iOS in the US and Facebook Android in Germany, and then try to have like custom multipliers for those.
Right. And so I think where you could run into trouble is like, let's say on your typical ARPU curve, your D7 ROAS target is, let's say it's 30%. Yeah. But then if you're running sales, or if you know you're running across a specific channel that monetizes very quickly and then flattens out, then you can have a significant miss, right? That would be the problem.
Especially if you do it in the first 7 days. So the thing is, whenever you optimize for one metric, that means that you can also spoof it or just like hit that metric, hit that metric and not necessarily hit the goal.
Right.
That's what happened with like CPI initially. Then like we had install fraud. With D7 ROAS, we have ROAS-based bidding. With whatever the target is. Well, again, with CPI, you can have misleading ads. So whatever the target is, you can hit it, but that doesn't mean that you're going to win.
Right, and then I think D7 ROAS is great when you have existing data, right? So like, let's say you've done 50 match 3 games and you're doing a new match 3 game. You're like, D7 ROAS target should be this because you have a lot of data. You know exactly what that ARPU curve is going to look like. But for a new game, how would you guys come up with a D7 ROAS target for a game that's that's never been launched before?
It's really tough. I mean,
it's not deterministic. You can't. You don't have the data to know.
And also for new games, you kind of expect the money to pay back significantly, pretty fast. And then you can kind of extrapolate based on the early data what the.
I think one of the things I like to do is just basically have a soft launch. In soft launch, look at the shape of the curve.
Exactly.
And then map. Not the absolute values, but the shape of the curve to your main, like if you're going for a Western market, try to find a market that has similar curve, but then just kind of extrapolate it up.
So I guess my counter question to that is like, if it's a brand new game, you don't have the data, you can at least see the early shape of the curve. But how do you know? Well, you won't. The longer term engagement of that user.
Well, that's why in soft, I'd like to see as long of a curve as possible. And then just you have to do something. So I would model that curve to the hard launch curve.
So with that said, what would you recommend as like a decent soft launch period so that you can get that data?
So that would depend on the genre of the game. If it's match 3 years. So that's the problem. If it's hyper casual, 7 days, right? So
I think going back to Play Studios, our Israeli team, the Pop Slots studio, did an incredible job, and kudos to them for building a predictive LTV model to kind of measure performance, because like they did come to realize just looking at D7 ROAS, they're not all the same, right? So they essentially bake in variables as in what geo did this user come from? What is the user engagement within the first couple of days? Like how length of session, depth of session.
I mean, cost.
Cost is a pretty big. And all of a sudden, and they ran that test for over a year. Right, because they realized it's not something you could just do overnight, and over a course of the year they fine-tuned it, and it got to a point where they're close to 90% plus accurate with their prediction, and that's insane.
Right, and this is, I think, one of the issues that a lot of people, novice game studios don't understand, is that the companies that have done 50 match 3s or 50 slots games, they've got so much data that they have a PLTV, predictive LTV or ARPU model, so that when they launch a new slots game or new match 3 game, they're way ahead of the curve than you are in terms of being able to understand how much they can buy, what to set their ROAS target, what to set their payback window to, all that kind of stuff.
If you go into any startup, especially gaming startup, meetup or whatever, that's probably the number one question that's being asked. How do you define your early indicators for success? Because a lot of people don't know. They don't have that data. And I've kind of have seen that come up quite a number of times.
But going back to your blog post, so you're not necessarily saying don't use D7 ROAS, right? But what approach would you specifically recommend in terms of?
It shouldn't be used as an isolated metric, basically. If that's the only, because the reality is most teams don't really have a 10-person data science team, or most companies, and as a result of that, you have to be a little more scrappy and use metrics that are easier to understand or calculate.
Right.
So if you end up using D7 ROAS, at least define benchmarks for different traffic types and different sources, and that should help you hit your goals, like business goals, faster. I guess that the main point of the article is just to be more kind of cognizant of what are the changes in the market that happen because of ROAS-based bidding. And if you take those into account, then it's more likely you'll succeed in achieving your marketing goals or company goals.
Right.
So that's it.
I think just to add on to that, like a lot of times, even certain established companies, when they launch a new game, there's two questions that often come up. And one is like how much budget, and that I think it's a different conversation, but we can bring a little bit in here. Is like how much budget should we allocate to the launch of this game? What would the channel breakdown be, right? And I think sometimes the disconnect is that they don't look at how the channel breakdown will bake into the PLTV of that game, right? They just trying to consolidate into a single thing and it's all one curve. It's not, right? If you decide to launch with 60% on SAN network versus 30%, your PLTV could potentially be, not your PLTV, but your repay window might be very, very, very different. Yeah. So if that's the case, like that should also be taken into consideration.
Cool. And then in terms of like when you're separating out different monetization profiles or ARPU curves, so some of the key key factors to look at you mentioned were channel, platform, geo. Is there anything else, or are those three the main?
Creative type could be one more. If a user is coming from like a playable versus a video, can be quite different.
Right.
Assuming that the playable works as a kind of pre-tutorial.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of different. It's really up to like the scale of the spend, because right. If you're driving 100 installs a day, it's going to be really hard to go that granular.
Right.
But if you're driving tens of thousands of installs a day, then you can go pretty granularly and do different, like analyze different slices and make different KPIs for those. Okay,
cool. Any other thoughts in terms of this topic? But it sounds like you got a lot of great feedback in terms of your blog post, right?
Yeah, I expected it to do well. I did the clickbaity article, the headline, and I had money on fire as my like feature photo. And I'm super happy with the feedback. Yeah, I'll try to write more. It takes a lot of time, and I'm not necessarily feeling really comfortable writing in English. But I think I should do it more
for sure,
and cover some of the topics that are. These are not really general topics. They're like targeting just people who've been doing UA for a while.
I really like the article specifically because it calls out a question that I think everyone at some point asked, but no one ever asked out loud.
But I do also think that it might be kind of specific to UA folks. But I do think that if more executives really understood these concepts more fundamentally, they'd stop making kind of dumb mistakes. If I'm being honest.
I mean, I was at a Facebook holiday party yesterday, and their feedback was really good because they kind of like sensed that this is happening, but they were not really sure.
Okay.
Because everybody's just like using VO, and people are using it because it's working, but at the same time, what are the problems of having a product that's creating a hyper competitive environment? So yeah, exactly. I mean, it's good that executives are aware what are kind of.
Well, hopefully we'll be aware.
We'll be aware.
Even on the on the sales side, it's important for the product teams of the companies of Google or Facebook to understand this.
Yeah.
Right, because oftentimes, like in the past when I've interacted with Facebook product teams, like they're also building in a vacuum, right? They think that I'm building something. Hey, I can optimize towards payers. Like you should pay as much as you need to get this individual, but then they didn't realize that you're creating such a hyper competitive environment that you're isolating it to only certain companies that can afford to pay that price.
Yeah, it becomes a how deep is your pocket type of game. Versus LTV and UA scale.
Yeah, which is always interesting because like when you're talking to startup, like people are like, oh, I just want to start spending. Should I spend my money on Facebook? I'm like, how much money do you have?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting topic, but no, well-written article.
Thanks, guys.
All right, great. And that's a wrap for our latest UA Coffee Talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.